I will record. So, yeah. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So our first presenter is Emma Mary Love, and she's a senior lecturer in the School of Engineering of the Built Environment at Birmingham University, I think. And the title of her presentation is Through the Modern Graffiti Photographers Lens. So Emma, the floor is yours.
Hello.
So you have 15 minutes and I'll let you know when you're getting close to.
Yeah, no problem. I can't actually share my screen. It says that it's been disabled. Host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Yeah, I will need to do this every time I will start. So, okay, now you should be able to share. Try now, please. Okay, it's working.
So can you see that all okay? I'll assume that you can. Okay, so hello everybody. I hope you've had as good a morning as I have. It's been really interesting. The quality of the presentations has been extremely enjoyable and terrifying in equal measures for me, as this is the first time I've actually presented at an academic conference on the subject of graffiti or anything related to graffiti at all. So I am absolutely terrified of all of you because I'm very conscious who's in the room and most of you are my peers. So please be kind to me. So I'm going to get cracking straight away. This isn't a paper, this isn't a project, this is just some observations and some reflections that I have about, as Isabel said, the very important subject of photography within graffiti. Tiny little introduction about me first of all. So I am course leader and a senior lecturer in building surveying over here in Birmingham in the School of the Built Environment. We're also attached to engineering, so quite unusual in the sense that I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a social scientist as such, but my interests are very much to do with cultural heritage protection, urban planning, public space, placemaking, culture, community. I have been stopping and starting a PhD for around about 5 years now, stopping and starting because it was through a part-time route and had many issues with the supervisory team. Not blessed in Birmingham the same way that I think other countries are necessarily blessed with some of the openness about research in areas such as this. And of course, I'm a building surveyor, so it's all about the built environment. So it's very much positioned within a built environment context. So it's been quite hard, but I'm back on it now. Started afresh February this year, and it's going relatively well. Away from that, however, I'm also a semi-professional photographer, and I have been documenting graffiti as a graffiti photographer across the UK and quite large swathes of Europe for the best part of a decade. So I'm actually kind of, when I say I'm walking the walk, I'm literally walking the walk as well as talking the talk when it comes to sort of graffiti photography. Very passionate about it, and it's a hugely important aspect of my life. So just sort of briefly about how today will go, I'm just going to be talking about why it's important to document graffiti from my perspective, the perceptions of photography and the purpose of them, the timeline of the change, which I think is quite an important thing that we talk about at this particular moment in time. The broken connection to source and how I think that's going to cause issues, some of which have actually been touched on by other presentations bizarrely this morning, which is quite interesting to see. And maturity, which unfortunately is unavoidable for all of us, but certainly from the graffiti culture and graffiti photographers, it's something which is unavoidable. So just briefly what I'm going to talk about today. So sort of general questions really, why it's important to document graffiti. Obviously, as I'm very much speaking to the converted here already. It's this, graffiti, and when I talk about graffiti, I'm very much graffiti, and we've looked at the definition, and I've got to give a shout out to the Annas. I loved your definition of graffiti versus street art or urban art. yeah, it's pretty much almost exactly how I have defined it in my own PhD literature review. For me, graffiti, I'm interested more in the illegal aspect of graffiti rather than street art. So rather than murals, although obviously there is this sort of crossover between the two, but really it's the literal illegal aspects of graffiti. So the use of letters, the making of marks, so tags, dubs, and all of the things that come along with it are the things that really are of interest to me, and particularly the generation of the older school of generation of graffiti writers, so the originators, so 80s onwards, if we were going to start a particular time scale. So I see capturing graffiti, sharing it, is to me the main role of the graffiti photographer. So it's that connection to that moment in time and indeed what was happening in society at the time, because to me graffiti is this storytelling narrative, this symphony that's happening in the landscape that is often completely oblivious to 95% of the population unless they get robbed, and then all of a sudden they see a mark on a wall and the whole area is assumed to be a violent area because somebody has had the audacity to put some paint of colour on a wall. So it's this spatial temperance, this record, and I think that what graffiti photography has done over the decades is capture this authenticity of this act of graffiti. And of course it would be completely lost. I've got an example of that. It's actually one of my, it's quite an old photograph of mine taken, it was actually, I put 2011, but it's actually probably a little bit before that, at a illegal spot in Birmingham. And the image that you can see, it says Bromford Skins. It actually had a date of 1979 on it, so it's actually done in obviously 1979. And it's a Doc Martin. It's referring directly to a group of skinheads. I'm assuming that everybody in the room knows what skinheads are. I know we've got a lot of, like me, vinyl music people in the room, and hopefully you'll remember skinheads, all to do with two-tone and sort of 70s punk, sort of. And basically it was the Bromford Skins. So this particular part of Birmingham is called Bromford, and they were basically making their mark on the wall that they had been there in 1979. Sadly, this wall has, by people that knew not the harm they were doing, has gone. It's been gone many times over because it's a very popular spot, although it's inaccessible now. It was inaccessible then, to be fair, but it's much less accessible now than it was then. And it's gone, but it's captured there in that moment in time. And I'm able to come to a group of international researchers and say, this was something done in 1979 by Bromford Skins because I took the photograph. So I'm kind of trying to prove the point of how important graffiti photography is, of course. So it continues with this communication between the sort of general community and between writers, builds on that community. I'm very much of the belief that graffiti, and that's one of the things that I feel quite privileged to have sort of become part of, is the community and the family of graffiti. And you know, the sharing of the photographs has always been, and I'm going to talk about how that's changed a little bit over the years, an integral part of the culture of graffiti and how we share that information and you know, styles. And you know, this morning we've talked about, I thought it was heartbreaking, I think it was Hugo was talking about, it might not have been actually, it might have been Vasco was talking about that there are no jams anymore, that they're not happening. And I was like, this filled me with pure sadness to hear that was happening and, you know, needs to be resolved. So the sharing of information through photographs has always been an integral part of the community, and how you got your message out to your fellow graffiti writers all over the world. So, you know, developing, motivating and encouraging this discourse across differing agencies. So, for example, where I live in Birmingham, it was really interesting. I've been to Lisbon. I've actually shot Lisbon a few times now. I have some very good graffiti writer friends in Lisbon. The jams and the way that the sort of the events which are organised. So we have sort of similar things here in Birmingham. But they're very much open to people that are not of the city, which is most unfortunate because it's sort of losing the identity of and the history of the actual core of graffiti in the city, whereas it's opened up to street artists that are famous people. And I actually have a quote from a local councillor that said, if we only invited local people, of which many are talented, I mean, we had Goldie come from Birmingham, for example, then we wouldn't get anybody to come and visit, and they wouldn't spend any money here, and it wouldn't be the tourist attraction that it is. And it's horrific. So obviously the role of a graffiti photographer in graffiti is that sort of neutral person, can share that intimate sort of relationship with what's happening on a wall and all of the events which are going on around it. And I think that's really important that we try and retain that as much as we possibly can as kind of life moves forward and new technology changes. Obviously, the perception of the photographer is often dictated by the age, the location, preferred genre, whether it's street art, whether it's graffiti, whether it's at a jam or an event, or whether, like me, you prefer to have a more sort of one-to-one, I will go to a city and I will communicate with a local group of graffiti writers before I go, and then they will generally give me a tour around and basically look after me and make sure that I'm not safe and to get arrested and stuff like that, which is always really useful. And I prefer that kind of, it's me and my camera rather than it all being about me or about the quality or the products that I'm making, because to me it's all about graffiti rather than the photograph. Sort of the message, they're two very different things. The ownership of the work, it remains with the person that has produced it. I'm just privileged enough to be capturing them actually doing that. So I think that there's also a significant shift change for how graffiti photographers are being, how they are, the actual role itself is changing, because there's a difference that people are starting to misunderstand the rules. So they will go onto social media and they will give away the spot name, they'll give away the names of, they'll talk about beef that would be privately sorted out, but they'll bring the almost as if it's got a sort of excitement value to it. And it's a shame because it's actually having a real impact upon all of us really within the graffiti community, because it's not about the photographer and it's never been about the photographer. It's about the graffiti and the act of graffiti itself. So just a very sort of quick sort of timeline, because I am conscious as well of the time as well, and I did want to keep this to 10 minutes. I'm nearly at 9 already.
Emma, sorry, it's okay, because I think the second presenter is not here, so it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just terrified though that people like Jacob are going to ask me questions and I'm going to disappear because he knows I'm terrified of him, because I absolutely adore him. But anyway, so I just want to go, basically. I'm frightened. So anyway, back to this. So I've done a sort of a little bit of a timeline, and I've got to say, one of the things that inspired me, I'm not even necessarily going to be talking about this in any great detail in my PhD. It's just that this is passion of mine. And there are many of us that are in the room today that were in the room last year when we had the great James Prigoff with us. And it really kind of hit it home to me when we lost him this year, that things are changing and there's a natural course of things that none of us have any control over. But if we need to stop and recognise the importance of those things and maybe try and stop some of those breaks in the chain of information while we still have the opportunity to do it. And also, I know, and again, I absolutely adored the two Annas. Your young researchers, I mean, I'm a young researcher, but I'm not young, the two aren't exactly combined together. But I feel that you have this mantle of responsibility that we pass to you to make sure that all of these things are covered in the future when we've all sort of retired. So 1970s, obviously late 80s, we had the original photographers, and I like to call those days the source. So for me and for the generation of writers that I consider to be the people that I work with the most and the people that I probably have the most respect for. So they're people that are teenagers that started in the 1980s, and they will always hold, Chalfant, Cooper, Prigoff, Castleman as the original source of what started them off in graffiti. And of course, when, you know, and Keith Bow, who was an English, he actually started in the late 1970s capturing New York graffiti on trains. That to me is the source. It's where we owe everything, our debt of gratitude to. And even though obviously, you know, as time has gone on, we've started to recognise Martha Cooper when she's got her film. And, you know, I went to Madrid to look at Henry's amazing exhibition. You know, they were very much capturing something that was new and preserving it from the very beginning. And to me, that is the source, and the work that they did can never be repeated. Moving on to sort of like the early 1990s, the beginning of the new millennium, I'm kind of like jumping like mass times in here. It was the graffiti writers themselves, the kids. They had film cameras. They were capturing things that there was no photographers going around doing it properly. I have a large collection of original photographs that have been gifted to me over the years. And a lot of them were like teenagers, and their dad would take them, you know, off under the M6, which is like a massive motorway here, to, you know, and break down, you know, fences and go through, you know, to try and find spots as a bit of an adventure on a Sunday morning. And there's loads of these sort of films and this history of, and they're all obviously, you know, terrible quality, but they're really important because, you know, these film images can't be replicated in any other way. So people, so writers with cameras, people that had hobbies to do it. But one of the key things that was really important at the time was the underground magazines, the graph scenes. You know, people had pen pals where they would share these photographs. I actually have a friend who still has all of his letters. I mean, he's in his sort of late 40s now, but he still has all of his letters and photographs of that he sent by post, by letter, as a pen pal to a writer up north, you know, the other part of the country. And, you know, these are kids like sharing it and drawing graph scenes and this whole underground scene. And of course, the bench culture of sitting and sharing information and sketching information because they'd seen, you know, Star Wars, they'd sort of seen the film and they wanted to kind of replicate that. So that was sort of still happening. And then it ended, and I was very interested to see that we're having at some point somebody talk about 90s graffiti and how it kind of like all went a bit, you know, off. And I can say categorically for here that a certain age group, my peer age group, and it stopped because of the rave scene, because they basically discovered acid and raves, and off they went, and they left all their cans as they ran off into a field somewhere. So there's a definite stop in the culture around about the sort of 90s, and then it sort of generally starts to sort of seep back in again where they return back to it. So then from the early 2000s to 2010 approximately, there was a general resurgence of graffiti photography as a form of documenting the new and the old generation of graffiti and graffiti writing. And you can see that when you start to look back at things such as, if any of you were on, some of you are far too young to know, I have a clue what I'm talking about, genuinely, but things such as MySpace and Photoblock and Flickr, which of course is still going, but is on its last breath really as it comes to graffiti photography. And because the internet had started to kick in and we started to have that opportunity to sort of share things. Face Party was another one that graffiti writers used to share quite a lot, which was a forerunner before Facebook and, you know, everything that we know now. So there's this accessibility and this understanding of real terms. And of course, if you do, as I have been doing for what feels like my entire lifetime, a literature review on graffiti and particularly graffiti and research, you can see in an academic sense that kind of time there was this implosion of people, of academics wanting to talk about graffiti, and you know it was a really fashionable academic subject to be looking at as well. And you can see that on a timeline when you start to put your keywords into search for it. So then from sort of 2010 to present day, which is where I can kind of speak very much as a first person, as a photographer, I have this genuine fear that there is this end of graffiti photographers documenting graffiti solely for the benefit of graffiti, because that's what I feel I do. I might put a photo, and actually I have stopped actually putting things onto Instagram and sharing them because it felt so inappropriate during the pandemic, because we're all incredibly sad and terrible things happening around us. But I kind of started to step away from it a bit anyway, because I'm thinking, why am I doing this? Am I doing this for some kind of like dopamine hit, some self-glorification? You know, I want to do things for the benefit of the culture rather than the benefit of me. I have them all supporting me for my PhD because it's going to be funny when I'm Dr. Love, but because they know that I'm trying to give them a voice within an academic sense. So I kind of stepped back a bit, but I was also very much aware that there are now this group of people, and it's fueled a lot by the fact that photography is quite a fashionable thing to do, that we have phones that make it a lot easier. We have Instagram, so people are looking for that personal fame. There is this culture vulture aspect to it. There is the cultural appropriation aspect to it, which is horrific, but you know, it is what it is. And there's this saturation of possibilities with cameras on phones, share on social media. You know, you get that kind of buzz of joy. You know, they appear to feel happy to be part of something that's a little bit naughty, or you know, when some of the images that got are very much naughty because you know it's effectively trespass. So you know, and I just feel that. That is having an impact and a danger because of the legal implications, not just the relationship implications between crews and creating beef. And, you know, people are giving away spots, people are giving away real names, people are creating, I mean, there's been quite a few really bad arguments beef where people have got really quite very personal. And it's become something much more than what it should be about, which is about making letters on a wall, and it's starting to become something which is quite difficult. So I think the future is that we've hit this kind of saturation point that we need to stop and we need to stand back and make a few decisions about how we're going to move forward with documenting graffiti. I've noticed this quite a few times, and I've been asked many times because one of the things that I'm very proud that I have done is capture graffiti, very, very old graffiti, original graffiti, and because of the type of paint that it was used, which obviously was stolen back then in the 80s, it's still intact, probably because it's full of lead, but things will last like 35 years if you put them in a particular place. And I capture them, and an academic asked me if I would like to do put some geotags on them and map them so that people could go and find them. And of course, no, I didn't want to do that because that would ruin the spots, because they would become ruined by people that don't need to see them. I can share them in my photographs, they don't need to know the location of them. So there has been this saturation point where there's an Instagram overload, I feel, or there was an Instagram overload. Obviously the travel restrictions for the people that genuinely want to travel, I am starting to go out of my mind because I can't go to Copenhagen, even though I'm going to have to say sorry because we beat them at the football last night. I can't even talk about that. I'm desperate to get over to Copenhagen. I'm desperate to come back to Lisbon. I'm desperate to travel to all the places. But of course, we haven't been able to do it. And I think one of the things that's happened on social media is that we've had this COVID quiet from people that genuinely feel frustrated and feel that it's not appropriate to say much, or just haven't had much to say because of the pandemic. It was interesting when I was when Lachlan was talking earlier on, and Lachlan's somebody else that I know who work extremely well. I'm also terrified of him. I have a lot of friends in Melbourne and Sydney, and it truly is graffiti writers rather than mural street artists, and it's been tough. The mental health aspect of what this has done to people who are defined by being able to be free and do free things, graffiti, has been awful for them, absolutely terrible. So there's been this sort of quiet pulling away, I think, by people that it's really affected on Instagram, and I think that's reflective of the pandemic, and hopefully that will sort of start to bounce back. But I think one of the key things for the new, and I call them the new people that are coming into graffiti from a photography perspective, is this misunderstanding of the rules, that they don't know the history, they don't know about Martha Cooper, they don't care about Henry Chalfant, they don't know about Joe Conzo, they don't recognise the source. And I think that that's something which is going to be really problematic for us as we move forward. So the craft is maturing, and if you can see, I've pulled the little green alien man out of that. So the source, the originators themselves are maturing and aging. So the people that are spreading the rules and sharing the rules, and the originators of the hierarchy of graffiti are maturing and aging. And sadly,
Emma?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can start coming to the end so that we can have
I will do. So
great, so that we can have questions.
Okay, no problem. So the links back to the source are starting to disappear or weaken. It's creating a break in this chain. So for example, if you ask people, do you know the rules? Do you know that you shouldn't be sharing this? Do you know, is your location off on your phone, etc.? Do you know where it all came from? And a lot of people are now starting to look at different things such as NFTs, even some of the graffiti writers, about how they share that information. And that's going to create a whole other set of issues about how we protect and maintain the cultural heritage of it in the future. So I'll skip over this. So this was sort of blending the legal and the illegal together, but because we've sort of talked about that, the two Annas did that sort of like extremely well, I have to say. So I'll just go straight to my summary. So it's that graffiti has and always will be an integral part of aspects to the graffiti community. Long may that continue, but it's a little bit broken at the moment. We need to start to look at some of the people that are doing it for the wrong reasons and why they would be doing it for the wrong reasons, and perhaps start to educate them in the way that it should be done. There does need to be this understanding of what is right and what is wrong and what can be potentially quite dangerous, because eventually, even though my preference is illegal graffiti, I'd like to still keep graffiti illegal, but I'd like to keep the people that are doing illegal graffiti out of actual prison. So understanding the ownership, and again, I won't sort of talk about that too much, because there was the fantastic gentleman before the break talking about, I loved the Vatican. I just kept thinking, you know, don't ever take on the Pope. It's brilliant. Just superb about the ownership. And of course, you know, 5 points, etc., was interesting to all of us. So it's just about doing the right thing the right way by the right people. And this particular image was shared with me by an old school writer down in London, just proving really that, you know, graffiti writers are maturing, and some of the things that perhaps weren't as important to them in the past, you know, they aren't anymore. And actually everything matures in the end. And that is me done. So thank you very much for listening. I was absolutely terrified. I'm still absolutely terrified. Please keep the questions nice and gentle. Pedro, stop shaking your head. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you. Oh my God, Joe. Jacob only put some cuts up. Thank you very much. If you would like to have a look at some of my limited, they are limited because I haven't updated my website for years because of all the reasons mentioned before. Please feel free to go and have a look at my website. And I will need to speak to many of you. Potentially in the room, there is an external examiner for my PhD, potentially. So I do want to make connections. It's been a joy. I've not been with Urban Creativity. I've been with you from the beginning. I've just been very, very quiet because I'm scared of you all. So any questions, anybody?
I think John may have there, Isabel.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you stop sharing the
so
that I can see if we have questions? Yeah.
Hi everybody.
Who said I cannot see you?
It's Jaume. It's Jaume. Jaume and Jacob.
Okay.
Hi.
Yeah, see you. Okay, go ahead, please. Sorry.
Hi again. Emma, I want just one thing. Congratulations. And another thing that I want to say is to share here a piece of a small article that I made in the same, trying to find the same aim of you making the periods of graffiti photography. But my point of view is really different of yours. So by this reason, I think that I'm sure that you enjoy it because it's a complementary work, sure.
Absolutely. I believe was it you that wrote something, wrote up the article from James Brigoff the week that we lost him? Was it you that wrote an interview that had happened with him recently or just before he sadly passed away? I read it was from somebody in this group who had just set up an interview and had done some questions with Jim and then shared it, and it was beautiful. It was a beautiful piece of work. But thank you very much for that. I look forward to looking at these comments properly as well. I am literally shaking. You wouldn't think that I literally am the course leader and I do this for a living in front of people. You're more terrifying than all of my undergraduates that I've ever taught, ever. It's mad. It's absolutely ridiculous. So are there any other questions?
Yeah, we have Jacob. Sorry, Emma, you cannot help it. So keep it short, please.
Unmuted. First, I want to thanks for the great presentation. Super interesting. And I had several small kind of questions or reflections, but perhaps we could take it. But I will try to keep it short. I really enjoyed this kind of timeline that you presented with. But just as an artist, I also thought it's interesting that you define it all as photography, because I think what you also did was you pointed out a kind of media history of mass media history of graffiti rather than perhaps photography history, even if photography is the primary medium document in the documenting process. But that also brought me to think of how you defined graffiti photographers, and if you have thought about the difference between the graffiti photographers, for example, Marta Cooper, as you mentioned, and somebody partly like myself, who is perhaps more of a photography collector, sometimes my own pictures, but especially when I was a kid, it didn't really matter. As you said, it was what's on the picture that was the important thing. So this is a little bit of the cultural, social, and institutional identity of the photography versus the photographer.
Yeah,
That's
I couldn't agree more. And for me, my photography is quite, so I don't go to jams to take photographs of photographers. I hate it. I feel that you'll see a graffiti writer. So we recently had Brim from the Tax Crew come back, because he was here obviously in the 80s with Goldie and you know, loads of them. And he came back, and there's a photograph of him painting a wall at this jam. And then there's just this mass of like 40 people behind, and they've either got cameras or they've got phones, and I hate it, because for me, and I actually hate the term graffiti photographer. You know, I follow you, you know, we know we follow each other on Instagram, and you know, I have this, to me it's about this intimacy of capturing the act and the person making the acts of graffiti, whereas people will take the photograph of the wall and then they'll sell it for a calendar, or they'll sell it in a shop as a print. And it's I find that horrendous, because, you know, to me, what Martha did and what Henry did it was about the culture. They were capturing something that was people driven. It wasn't about the art really on the wall. It was about the person, people doing something, and that's what they captured, and that's what I love, and that's what that photographer I always hope to be. But yeah, there is a very, very big defining difference there. It's the first time we've ever actually spoken, Jacob. I am trembling like a leaf.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions? Anybody?
We have another question, but I don't know, Pedro, if it's too late. We have a question.
Needs to be very short.
Okay, so Negar, I don't know if you can keep it short.
Or if it's long, you can put it on the chat. Yeah. Negar, are you there?
Sure, I will just write it in the chat then.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Negar. Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you, Emma.
No, thank you, everyone. I didn't have to moderate anything because we only have.
Yeah,
Emma.
sorry.
It was so great.
Yeah. It was a crazy panel, this one. So as a panel was 1-person panel. So I thank you very
keynote
much,
speaker.
Isabel.
Emma became a keynote speaker.
Yeah. I move forward to Marianne Walker. Are you there?
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me okay? Because my internet connection keeps going out.
Yeah, I think it's mine also, so.
Okay. I'm going to stop the video, partially because my internet connection and partially because I'm really nervous, but okay.
Okay, go for it.
Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I'm Marianne. I'm a second year PhD student at the University of Loughborough, and I'm currently working on a project about urban art and how it's used as a tool of activism, particularly relating to reclaiming space, and focusing specifically on the sites of Birmingham and Barcelona. So today I'm going to be presenting one aspect of my project, and that's specifically about how urban art's activist ability has changed. And this is all about it in relation to a changed context where urban art is increasingly becoming monetized and appropriated. So before I start, it's probably important to note that I'm kind of in the beginning of this project. I've just started field work, so all the results I'm presenting are very new and not complete at all. So first of all, a bit about how urban art has been used as an activist tool in the past. Throughout history and across the globe, activists have used urban art as a tool to promote movement and encourage social change. When we think of events such as the Arab Spring, the Occupy movement, or the recent BLM protests, it's often the images of the art of the street that come to mind. The street here acts as a medium that gives power to voices that may not be heard in the traditional sense, for example, through the media. Additionally, its public presence gives it an ability to act as an ideational resource, which is useful in claim making. It can be viewed by huge numbers of people, anyone who passes by it, meaning it has the ability to disseminate a range of ideas, perspectives, and opinions. By altering walls, alternative ways of seeing are presented to those who view it. The public who witness the art can be, albeit sometimes subconsciously, engaged in a political process, experiencing increased consciousness about the issues displayed. In this way, it can be argued that urban art acts as a tool of political protest and mobilization. But when we think about urban art and why it has an activist quality, we're not just talking about the actual image or the messages that are displayed in the image. It's intrinsically linked to the medium itself, and that's the walls, the street. Although McLuhan is concerned with electronic technology when he talks about how communicative media that individuals are exposed to work over them, not just by their content, but the way they interact with their environments, the same logic also applies to urban art. For example, if we take this picture here on the right, if you were to take that off the street and put it into the gallery, a picture of a balloon, that kind of thing, it would not have the same effect on you. Whereas if you know it's on an occupied building in Barcelona, it's a very different experience viewing it. So if we had to think about urban art activism in this way, we can see it can be due to its acts, not just its content or message. Through the unrequested interjection with the public domain, it can be viewed as an inherently political act, something that goes against the structure of how things are and the idea of property ownership. By taking over public space, be it a billboard, a council-owned space, or a privately owned building, it's an act of resistance in itself. This is something that has roots to Lefebvre's plea for the right to the city. Urban art acts as a tool to reclaim physical space, to change the aesthetics of space, and to make it publicly owned, used, and accessible. Its presence alters the city semiotics, giving artists power over the information and science it feeds to its inhabitants and visitors. By doing this, it takes back from the homogenizing practices of planning or promotional advertisement, contrasting with what Lefebvre called the bureaucratic consumption and reclaimed space from capital. So as an act in itself, urban art can act as a unique way to reclaim the urban experience. However, this view relies on the idea that urban art is intrinsically countercultural and heterogeneous to society. It relies on the belief that it's strikingly different to the fate of capital, to advertisements and to developments. Whereas this was the case previously, if we look at the changed function of the urban centres and means of accumulating capital in these urban spheres, it's questionable whether it's still true. We're in a context where cities have moved pre-industrial zones. Urban centres no longer rely on attracting industrial trades to accumulate wealth. Instead, they want to attract people, inhabitants, visitors, and tourists. To do this, cities have relied on implementing the creative city model, something that was made famous in 2002 by Richard Florida. In order to compete with other cities globally, they've employed the idea of creativity to achieve place branding, something that turns space from something physical into a branded commodity that is desirable and wanted. So you can see examples of this on the right-hand side of the slide. Think about the I Love New York famous logo and slogan. These images aim at giving the city a character, something that's attractive to people. Often here it's culture that's commercialized with a desire to promote a sense of individuality and distinction, building on the idea of authenticity and the spectacular. Urban art's not immune from this. It's something that's been used to create the idea of creativity and the branding of cities. Urban art is an expensive way of achieving city branding and attracting people. It's cheap to commission, and it holds the connotations of being heroic, intrepid, and materially expressing authenticity. Often the art that is used, however, is artificially, however, arguably these connotations are just in the name urban art, rather than the actual act or a piece. Often the art that is used is artificially created by developers to reach an end goal of profit, something that is often described as art watching. the way that culture and creativity is used to hide the same old neoliberal purpose of gaining profit rather than fixing societal issues. It feeds into the idea that the creative city is not so much creative as it is economic. While it may seem that artists are given a wider berth by the police and council authorities now, given the sheer amount of urban art that we see, if we look closer, we can see that its acceptance often comes from its financial value and their portrayal of a city that's marketable. The type of urban art that's encouraged, commissioned, or kept is manipulated to adhere to the image of the city, the image that the people in power want people to see. Something like this is something that often doesn't include anything that's about social inclusion or commentary or politically charged context and ideas, something that was traditionally seen in a lot of urban art. An example of this comes from the 2012 Olympic Games in London. Here, existing street art in the city was removed, as you can see in the right side of that picture, while a certain area was painted over by artists who were flown into the area with the aim of what the curator described as giving it that Camden energy and creating a kind of museum in the street. This isn't just something that's utilised by councils. Rather, we can see it led by private companies too. This kind of corporate-led art washing is where companies use urban art to promote themselves, such as here in Birmingham, which you can see on the left with an advert for Uber that's painting on the side of a building, or an advert for HSBC that's painted on the right. It's also a common theme with developers. The example in the left middle picture is London Newcastle, a development in Shoreditch. Here, they've adorned the walls of the building with urban art, making it promote a sense of individuality, authenticity to all its clients, where really the flats that it's actually covering are luxury and only available to a select few. It's important to point out here that we're not just talking about art that's been commissioned explicitly for these reasons. We're also referring to the use of this by companies using urban art pieces in their promotion without asking permission. Of course, as we heard earlier, getting copyright for urban art is quite a difficult thing. So you can see the examples here are brochures for luxury apartments in Birmingham that use the idea of street art in their brochures, basically. So what we're left here is the idea of creativity being used, but devoid of the actual meaning of creativity itself. We're seeing urban art being used as a means to actually promote Lefebvre's idea of homogeneous cityscapes. Whereas it's traditionally been used as a means to forge new alliances, social movements and collectives, its aesthetics are now frequently used to maintain the status quo rather than instigating change or activism. This in itself presents a huge contradiction for many artists who seek to use the medium itself of urban art to bring about change or reclaim autonomy over space. This is what my research is aiming to explore. If the medium of creating urban art is appropriated for private gain, how do artists who use the medium from activism manage it? So my research is focusing on two sites, Digbeth in Birmingham and El Raval in Barcelona. The reasons these have been picked is because they both have a large urban art scene that is used to brand the city and to attract economic gains. However, they both use these for different reasons, making it an interesting comparison. Digbeth has had a thriving urban art scene for a long time. In recent years, this has become celebrated in the commercial sphere, calling Digbeth the Birmingham Creative Quarter and making it one of the biggest areas in the UK in terms of growing residentialisation of the whole area. El Raval is a beacon of gentrification process in Barcelona, something that many cite starting back in 1992 when the Olympics happened and Barcelona began its journey into being branded as a tourist city. Once described as a no-go area in Barcelona, Raval continues to be rampant with countercultural activities. And this image is something that the council now promote, giving Raval this idea of an edgy area where urban art is used as place branding to attract visitors there. The methodology I've used in this project for this particular aspect was in-depth interviews that were semi-structured with urban artists. Ideally, they would have been in person, but with COVID, they were all done over the phone or over Zoom, which actually came with its own benefits because people were allowed to remain anonymous when a lot of what they're doing is illegal, something that benefited. So again, here it's important to point out these are very preliminary results, but so what I've found in Birmingham so far. All artists I spoke to acknowledged the difficulties they've had in navigating a new context where urban art in Birmingham is now increasingly popular. One key thing that they had a problem was the increasing number of street art festivals that are being set up in Digbeth. They discussed how when they took part in these festivals, they were actually policed in what they could paint. They were told they just had to paint a pretty picture. It couldn't have connotations or any ulterior meanings that were politically minded. In terms of the organisers of these festivals, they spoke about how they were alien to the community and to the urban art scene in Birmingham. They talked about how they exploited them for money, how they paint and then their work would be sold, whilst they would be getting being asked to paint for free and not getting any economic return. And another big thing they talked about was how when you see street art in Birmingham, a lot of the famous pieces that appear on tours are actually just commissioned by street art companies. And again, this is where the art is controlled. And they talked about how artists are pushed like agents. They talked about how power dynamics now control the street art scene, with those in positions of power running corporations dictating what goes on to Birmingham streets. Another common phrase that was also brought up was about the blurring of advertisements and urban art, something we saw before with the Uber and HSBC advert. And they talked about how because of this, it's so hard to stand out now because of the sheer amount. However, it's important to note that no one I spoke to was put off from continuing using urban art as a medium to achieve change and reclaim space. Rather, there seems to be a great determination and now not just to reclaim space, but also to reclaim the medium itself of urban art.
The
So in
final
terms of
minutes, if possible.
Final minute.
Okay. Final minute, yeah.
Okay, so one of the most, these are the strategies that artists talked about. So one of them was about direct defacing. So for example, with the Uber thing, you can see one of the artists I spoke to put a paste up over it describing art washing. Another one was about using explicit imagery. So artists I spoke to said they hadn't done this before because they didn't want to alienate people, but they now said that it was needed because it's what made them stand out. And another big thing was subvertising, which again it's nothing new, but they said how artists were turning to it more, which is kind of interesting when you're trying to stand out on the street by mimicking advertisements, but saying the sheer amount of urban art made them had to do this. And then very quickly, in Barcelona, again, very, very preliminary results. Artists here again mentioned the problems about place branding and how it's been used to give an edgy picture to tourists. That one talked about how you can paint in the centre in Raval, but not on the outskirts. So where working class people live, they weren't allowed, but in that centre where tourists were, they were allowed, and how this was a problem. And they also talked about how the art was devoid of meaning. And last slide. So in terms of strategy, what was different in Barcelona is people didn't turn to different kinds of art to promote activist ideas. Rather, they used the popularity of it to promote ideas itself. For example, a big thing was about promoting community. As you can see in the picture on the left, it's a project where they posted pictures of people who lived in the local community to remind people that Barcelona isn't just for tourists, it's for the community too. And another one on the right is about how one artist I spoke to was painting murals which portrayed Barcelona's history, the wider history that's not displayed in the tourist narrative. For example, this is a picture of the workers' strike where they achieved the first 8-hour working day. And I'll stop there. Sorry, I've run over.
No problem. Was great. Maybe if someone have a direct question, if not, we save questions for the final end of the panel. If no one has, or you can use, of course, the chat as a channel for communication also. Sure. Thank you so much, Marianne. You have an applause for Jacob there. So yeah, it's a really relevant, interesting topic. We have here also Barbara Priolo. She will talk us about public art in Riace. So, Barbara, yeah.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, yes, we can.
Okay. Perfect. So I'm Barbara Priolo. I'm a PhD student in Global Studies for an Inclusive and Integrated Society in the University of Dante Alighieri in Reggio Calabria in the southern Italy. And actually, I developed my research about public art in Riace during my MA in Visual and Critical Studies at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco. Today, the title of my presentation is Public Art in Riace, Challenging Capitalism to Recapitalize the Intercultural Community. My presentation is divided in 2 parts. The first one is about the local context, because I don't know if you know the place and the project, and also the social issues of these. And then the second part is about the public art in Riace and how it was transposed onto the community banknotes. So this moment of global economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 highlights how contemporary society is imbued and dependent on capitalism. While at a planetary level, most of the productive sectors are in crisis right now, there are those who are getting rich, exploiting the effects of the pandemic. Of course, I refer to organized crime, internationally known as the mafia. The mafia has historically profited from emergencies to accumulate capital. One example is the mafia's exploitation of the monetary resources that the Italian state earmarked to the migration emergency that has hit the Italian coast in recent decades. It has also caused the affiliation of poor migrants in the mafia gangs. For this reason, today in Italy, there have been many warnings issued by the media, which come from scholars of organized crime and the institutions. On the one hand, the mafia has taken advantage of the temporary media silence caused by the centralization of the attention on the virus. And on the other hand, it has taken advantage of the monetary deficit affecting many Italian companies and families. The mafia offered them an alternative to the systemic slowness of the Italian bureaucracy. So when the state does not intervene by providing immediate economic help, the sudden supply of liquidity from the mafia allowed Italian companies to keep their doors open. However, these businesses have been condemned to subjugation to the mafia clans, becoming themselves an instrument of money laundering. So all countries formed a proposal in the last months to face the economic crisis and the immediate need for liquidity. For example, the European Recovery Fund, the helicopter money, and also the hypothesis of a universal basic income. The project that I want to tell you about today is internationally renowned as the Riace model, and it was focused on the development of creative solutions similar to the ones that are being produced today to face the pandemic. The project was developed between 2004 and 2018 in the south of Italy during a decade of socioeconomic and political crisis due to significant migratory movements from Turkey, Kurdistan, and Iran. The Riace model was aimed at safeguarding the local economy of the small Calabrian town of Riace and at resisting the mafia oppression by helping the migrants. Domenico Lucano was elected as mayor of the city for 3 consecutive terms from 2004 to 2018. During his administration, he collaborated with a non-profit local organization called Città Futura, Future City, to transform Riace from a depopulated place to a global village where migrants were included in many activities aimed at the socio-economic rebirth of the town. So the migrants were welcomed by facilitating their involvement in local life, providing them with job, education, and social interactions. In this way, the migrants helped the touristic promotion of the village and the re-evaluation of traditional local handcraft activities. I will focus today on the introduction of a community currency called, in Italian, I buoni di Riace, that in English can be translated as Riace vouchers or bonuses, as well as the good in Riace. In general, community currencies are parallel monetary systems, often created by the NGO sector or by artists that circulate within a specific place and community. A community currency provides local people with liquidity, even though the national economy of their country is in crisis. So Riace Bonuses is a series of 36 paper banknotes circulated between 2008 and 2018 within the city of Riace. Lucano introduced them to provide liquidity to the migrants immediately upon arrival. Indeed, the Italian government provided a daily stipend to the migrants through public national funding, but the long delays of the Italian bureaucracy left the migrants without liquidity for several months. The vouchers therefore replaced the official Italian banknotes, the euros, until they actually reached the municipality of Riace. Indeed, I buoni di Riace are also known as the euros of Riace, as they display the euro symbol many times on the front and back side. Through the currency, the mayor also aimed to protest against the mafia in Calabria, known as the 'Ndrangheta, that has negatively impacted Riace long before the arrival of migrants and Lucano's project of inclusivity. It engaged oppressive tactics that led to a lack of job opportunities and the consequent depopulation of the city. Providing the migrants with liquidity through the community currency and jobs meant that the migrants no longer needed to join the local mafia clans. I argue that Lucano used the design of the banknotes as a visual strategy, drawing inspiration from various public artworks created by Italian and migrant artists in Riace. Those public art interventions have contributed to the creation of a new visual language and visual and value system, which allowed the village to become an internationally recognized model of integration. I'll show you briefly other artworks that were made in Riace.
You are on 5-6 minutes to the final. Okay.
So these also included murals, installations, road signs, and colors from flags corresponding to the origin countries of people who arrived in the city. So going back to the transposition of public art onto the banknotes, you can see that while on the official euro banknotes, the European flag is displayed on the left, on Riace vouchers, it is replaced by some triangular paper cuts that recall the shape of a flag. So these irregular paper cuttings are the reproduction of a public artwork titled Mundos, installed in Riace by the immigrant Uruguayan artist Coco Cano. You can see it clearly here. So the visual strategy used by the mayor was also that the banknotes featured Calabrian and Sicilian mafia victims to highlight mafia violence and injustice, as we saw in the case of Giuseppe Impastato, who is a really famous and popular Sicilian mafia victim because he was part of a mafia family, but he decided to fight against the mafia, and he also founded a radio station where he was talking about mafia bosses in Palermo. These are also other banknotes with Calabrian or Sicilian mafia victims that they used in the banknotes. In 2018, an anti-immigrant political party, the Lega, assumed the power at the national government in Italy, and Lucano was accused of fraud in the management of the migratory emergency. So the public funding to Riace's migrant was banned, as well as the Riace vouchers, the banknotes. So the legal trial is still in progress, yet most of the accusations against the mayor are falling apart, but the migrants remain with no money or jobs right now, and the local merchants in Riace have not been reimbursed yet. So though I Buoni di Riace was a temporary experience, it represented a third way compared to the bureaucratic approach of the Italian state and to the mafia criminal approach based on intimidation, violence, and capitalist enrichment. The community currency represented the appropriation of money, the principal capitalist tool, through the use of evocative visual references coming from the different public art interventions in the city. The parallel monetary system showed how public art can play a fundamental role in the development of resistance within oppressed local economies and community. In conclusion, the transposition on the banknotes has helped to challenge the oppressive dynamics of capitalism, using money not only as a means of economic transaction, but as a means of social interaction. It has finally decapitalized capitalism and recapitalized the intercultural community. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Really interesting case study. I don't know if you all agree, but really interesting. I don't know if someone have a direct question or comment at this point to Barbara, as she saved some minutes here. We have like 1 or 2 minutes that we can spend. If not, we can use the chat as usual and move forward for the next. Okay, so we move with energy, and thank you very much for this really interesting, non-expecting case study, because it merges so many different dimensions and very, very interesting.
Thank you so much.
It looks like a nice place to be, Riace. So maybe moving forward. Let me see here, Emilia.
Yes, I'm here. I'm present.
Great. So Emilia, she will be presenting us the conventionality and innovation, and she will talk about Détournement in 2011-2012 protest art. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for the introduction. I am currently a PhD student in art history from the University of Wrocław. It is in southwest Poland. And as it was already mentioned, today I am going to present a paper titled Conventionality and Innovation, Détournement in 2011-2012 Protest Art. As for the plan of my speech, firstly I would like to introduce the category of Détournement, a term popularized by the Situationist International, which, in my opinion, is crucial for understanding the topic of conventionality of protest. Nextly, translating the method of horizontal analysis on a micro scale for the paper's purposes, I shall present and analyze three case studies of protest art from the main social movements of that time, of 2011-2012. That is the Arab Spring, the Indignados, and Occupy, which hopefully will illustrate three different levels or three different ways in which images are reproduced during protests. And finally, I will move to the conclusions of my presentation. The main topic of my academic interest is the paradoxical phenomenon of restoration of certain historical traditions in protest art. And today I would like to ask how conventional was protest art from years 2011-2012, and were there any specific rules of formation of protest images? Analyzing recent protest art is particularly demanding because of the dispersion of research material that was documented in a non-institutional and accidental way. Great accumulation of graffiti, posters, leaflets, installations, net art, happenings, flash mobs, etc., and lack of agreed procedure for researching this topic makes studying protest art very challenging. Thus, in my research, I felt the need to adopt some kind of systemizing rule, or rather an organizing term. I hope that you can see the second slide.
Yes, it's working correctly.
Great. In my opinion, the key to understanding protest art dynamics and answer to the question about its conventionality is introducing the term of détournement, both artistic and activist practice consisting of appropriating, reusing, and recontextualizing any visual, artistic, linguistic, or real-life elements to create new artwork. A full description of its meaning, ways of functioning, and types are given by Guy Debord and Gilles Volman in their text called A User's Guide to Détournement. And this is an old text because it comes from 1957, if I remember correctly, so quite old. Its crucial part is when the board and Vollmann claim that, however, it is the situation is international, which conceptualized this practice and intentionally adopted it as one of the methods of artistic creation for the first time. The group didn't invent it because the Détournement was commonly used before the avant-garde was even born. And it is important to mention that because of the Détournement's subversiveness and versatility, the board and Vollmann saw this practice as a means to achieve cultural hegemony of the proletariat, as in a philosophy of Antonio Gramsci. And here on this slide, I hope you can see that the board and Vollmann wrote about the Détournement as a real means of proletarian artistic education, the first step toward a literary communism. Because visual and lingual messaging during revolt has to be concise and yet persuasive, the Détournement is commonly used during protest as a weapon, as well as a method of artistic creativity. And moving on to the main part of my presentation, I would like, as I said before, present 3 case studies of the Détournements in art from 2011-2012 protest that I selected to show the image reproduction mechanism that works in 3 different ways, which I called the historical, the external, and the internal modes of reproduction. The first example that I prepared for today is a poster from Indignados protest in Madrid from 2011. As you can see, it says Sol es la nueva Bastilla, which means Sol is the new Bastille. And it depicts Marianne, or a personification of liberty, from the famous Libertio Leading the People, a painting by Eugène Delacroix. We spoke about Marianne today, so I am glad that we have a broader context. As you can see, her attributes on the poster are altered because in one hand she is holding a peach rose, replacing the bayonet for the sign of a peaceful protest, and in other a Spanish flag instead of French. Sol is of course the short name for Puerta del Sol, a public square in Madrid, that was occupied by the protesters who camped there for several weeks. But this parallel of Puerta del Sol and the Bastille, along with recontextualized, updated Marianne, is incoherent, as Delacroix's painting was referring to the revolution of 1830, so to the July Revolution, and not the revolution of 1789, when the Bastille was stormed. In this case, the historical truth and accuracy of the visual and rhetorical components turned out to be less important than revolutionary symbolic, which was used to legitimate the protests of Indignados by comparing them with sans-culottes. Of course, it is important to ask why the author didn't choose to evoke a very rich Spanish revolutionary tradition. It seems that the historical references to revolutions of 1789 and 1830 were more fitting because of their historical distance and, in consequence, political vagueness, as nowadays French Revolution is generally perceived as a positive breakthrough and a milestone in pursuing social equality and modern European democracy, while a reference to, for example, the Spanish Civil War could be too polarizing. This way, the propaganda purpose of the poster is met. It endorses revolution, and yet, as the movement itself, stays clear of any definite political statements or affiliations to mobilize as many participants as possible. The second example, or rather a few examples of the Détournement of 2011-2012 protest art represent the external mode of reproduction of images. One of the main symbols, or should I rather say anti-idols of Occupy movement, is the Charging Bull, a bronze sculpture by Arturo Di Modica that is located on Bowling Green in the financial district of Manhattan since 1999. And you can see it at the bottom of the slide. It is a well-known tourist attraction, and it has its own website on which the bull is introduced as, and I quote, a symbol of courage and virility, and again a quotation, a way to celebrate the can-do spirit of America, and especially New York. It is worth noting how during Occupy protest, the symbolism of the charging bull hasn't changed. What altered was rather the protesters' perception of the statue's meaning. That way, the charging bull, formerly just a part of the cityscape of Manhattan, was deturned and equated with the symbol of aggressive, success-driven capitalism. As its symbol, it appears on the Adbusters promotional poster. You can see it on the left. And on many more, for example, showing the bull in Hopu on the right side, or accompanied by the proverb, take the bull by the horns. And the statue itself was also an object of various modifications. You can see one of them on the next slide. Here we have parading with its mini version as a false idol. It is certainly not a coincidence that in all Occupy Détournements, the charging bull is depicted as either an object of contempt and ridicule, or simply as an enemy to fight with. There are many more examples, including crude and vulgar ones, but they were all reproduced in the external mode. In this case, the reproduced image is not strictly connected to the circumstances of protest, but rather has its own history and meaning, independent from the course of revolt. The last type of reproduction of images during protest that I would like to discuss today is in many ways inverse to the external mode that I talked about a while ago. The internal mode consists of reproducing images inside the protest, when the revolt is being documented and processed, and in consequence, it produces its own mythology, symbols, images, and artworks. These side effects are separate and specific for each movement. An example of the internal mode of image reproduction is a photo of the girl in the blue bra, which was taken on the 17th of December 2011 during the protest on Tahrir Square in Cairo. And you can see it at the top of the slide. It quickly became a symbol of undeserved violation of the citizens, especially women, by the state and the military. The picture, spread in the Egyptian and foreign press, was deturned by Cairo street artists, which portrayed the blue bra girl as a personification of justice on the right side at the bottom, and as a superwoman on the left side. And the recognition of this photo was so wide that in Bahia Shabab's graffiti, the only thing depicted is a blue bra. It seems that this object became so significant for two reasons: because of lack of other distinctive features of the protester, and because of the broken taboo of violence stripping her from her abaya. The inscription below the image says in Arabic, there are people who have been stripped naked so you can live decently. And so it brings up both heroism and martyrdom of Egyptian protesters.
Okay, final minutes for.
Okay, I'm finishing.
Okay.
The scene of beating was also presented in one of the collages by Nermin Hammam from the cycle called Unfolding. By putting it in Japanese graphic landscape, Hammam tackled the topic of aestheticization and the realization of images showing violence. By shortly presenting to you three modes of image reproduction during protest, the historical, the external, and the internal, I hope I made it clear, or at least probable, that protest and revolt's visual sphere is in big part conventional and repetitive. Of course, it is dictated by propaganda purposes. Images and symbols on posters, banners, flags, leaflets, pins, etc. have to be comprehensible, easy to identify, and quick to reproduce further. Moreover, in my opinion, both historical and external modes of reproduction are related to or responsible for the conventional visual components of protest, and the internal mode, on the other hand, for more distinctive, innovative ones. During the 2011-2012 protest, both historicizations and external reproductions of the same symbols or slogans between different protests were very frequent. But along with them, each social movement, the Arab Spring, the Indignados, and the Occupy, had its own original internally created visual sphere. And moving on to the last closing remarks, the presented model of different image reproduction mechanisms supplemented by the situationist theory of the Détournement strategy, of course, has its limitations. It is strictly focused only on a specific part of protest images. That is mainly on conventional, reproduced, and recontextualized ones, neglecting the innovative creative examples that, in my view, appear significantly less often. Still, I believe the model has scientific value because of its nuanced answer to a question about conventionality and innovation of protest art, as well as its capability of organizing the material and enabling to see the individual artworks in their broader context. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions or remarks, please feel free to email me or to ask now if we have time for this.
Yes, we have 2 minutes. So if someone have any questions specifically for Emilia subject and presentation, thank you, Emilia. It was really interesting. And of course, a very pertinent topic. I don't know if someone wants to make a question, maybe they can raise their hand, or even maybe questions for all the panels. So the panelists for Marianne, Barbara, and Emilia, that they were present on this panel that I entitled Activism. It was a sequence that I hopefully you enjoyed. Okay, if there are no questions at this point, I will ask if someone reminds of some question or some specific topic for this panel. They can reach out through the chat and exchange emails and information as you please. I will move forward to Andrea. Andrea, are you there?
Of course I'm here. I have a terrible lighting today. I'm very sorry. I'm actually at in a hotel in Shanghai, but and the lighting is terrible. It look like
you are like in a moment of inquisition. You know, you are being inquired.
Yeah, like it's like a cop interview. So actually, yes. I like that it's exactly above my head. I tried to mess with it, but it didn't really work.
So welcome, Andrea. Andrea, you will talk to us about the politics of improvisation. So
I'm sharing my screen. So let's see.
Yeah, it's working correctly.
It's working. Let me just get to this. So I'll go.
It's yours. Take it. Thank you.
So, well, I'd like to start by saying hello to everybody. I see a lot of familiar faces. It's always very nice. Feels always like home, even if we're so far away from one another. And unfortunately, this is the second time around that we're, doing it virtually, but the virtual is also an extension of the physical space, as I wrote also. It actually was an article in the journal, in our journal.
The most relevant, it's the mental space, and that's shared both physically and virtually. Yeah. So let's go for it.
Distancing need not be social, right? So we are socially in a social relationship without proximity. So today I'm going to talk about the art, graffiti, and the politics of improvisation. This is, part of my research interest in street art and graffiti. So, there are a lot of steps that I actually skipped because I know that people that have been here at the conference have listened to me talking about subversiveness as ad nauseum, you might want to say. So there's not a lot of that today. And So actually, this is a work that, like a presentation that presents part of a work that is forthcoming in the Handbook of Improvisation in the Arts for Routledge. That actually is edited by Alessandro Bertinetto, and I forgot the other one. Now they're recording me. It's going to be a proof against my own lack of Marcello Ruta. Actually, it came to my mind. You have also to excuse me because actually in China is a little late at night. It's actually 11:25. So I'd like to start, with this quote that actually is taken from Rafael's book, and it's a quote from Spark, a Spanish writer. And he writes, actually, I've done 1,000 pieces, 10,000 tags, and they might have a similar style, but they're never the same. A trained practitioner could see the infinitesimal differences that the hand must always make. So what I'm interested in exploring today, and usually, generally in relationship with, my work on the political significance of street art, is its improvisational quality. So the idea is that that I take from this quote, but also from a general analysis of what street art is that works of street art are never fully planned in advance, and sort of the upshot or the intuition behind that is that the streets, so that the context in which works of street art are created, installed, realized, is a context in constant evolution. It's a constant in constant evolution, so that street artists are forced to make decisions about salient features of their works on the spot. Now, what I want to explore is that actually this spontaneity, so this kind of immediacy, lack of deliberation in deciding these features, doesn't simply have what you might want to call aesthetic consequences, but actually has a political significance. And this is something that usually has been largely ignored. So people have recognized that improvised forms of artistic expression, they might have enhanced expressiveness, like in musical improvisation, or they might have some kind of ethical significance. So they might be a metaphor, just like improvisations in jazz for community building. But no one so far has actually argued that improvisation can acquire or can carry political significance. But I'm going to try to do that. And what I'll try to show you is that the right to improvise, and the right to improvise in the city and to improvise the city, is an object of power struggle. And this power struggle, I call it the politics of improvisation. Okay. Oh, sorry. It never changes what I wanted to do. And so what I will actually argue is that street art's improvisational nature is grounded in its spontaneous uses of public spaces. Now, this force of spontaneity is essentially connected to an aesthetics of imperfection. And what I will show you, and what I will try to to demonstrate, is that these aesthetics of imperfection challenges the authoritarianism of what I call urban perfectionism. Urban perfectionism, now I will talk a little bit about that. I talk about that also in my article in Contemporary Aesthetics, for those of you who are familiar with my work. But it's basically the kind of dominant urban aesthetics that we see around our world, that around our cities, and that kind of aesthetic that it's grounded on, just to put it in a formula, on the broken window theory. Okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to start by explaining what I mean by street artist spontaneous uses of public spaces and how the spontaneity grounds its improvisational nature. And then I will actually clarify that spontaneity is essentially related to what I call on-the-spot adaptations that you will see relates to specific, in a particular concept, a notion that Kurt Iveson introduced in an article that is called The War on Graffiti and New Military Urbanism, if I remember the title correctly. And then I will conclude by talking about spontaneity and the politics of improvisation. Now I'll start to talk about, sort of basic question. As many of you know, I'm a philosopher by training and trade. And so I'm interested in these sort of very basic questions. When you start to think about whether or not street art is improvisational, these improvisational qualities, so you want to actually ask whether or not that is really true, that is really the case. Now, in the literature, there are actually claims or views against this very idea. Actually, one of the people that claims that not all street art is spontaneous, as I claim, is actually our friend Ulrich Blanchet. Actually, Ulrich is not here today. I haven't seen him. Is not here. But so in his book, I think it's the book on Banksy, he actually cites me and he says that, I always emphasize this aspect of spontaneity. It's something that I've done throughout the years, even before fully developing the idea that street art is improvisational. So he says, like, insofar as, street artists prepare often a lot in advance, I will not call a stencil, for instance, spontaneous street art. And of course, then, if you read accounts of how, for instance, writers develop their skills, you can, stumble upon one of my favorite writers on tags and throw-ups, as Chastanet, and he writes that, developing writing skills demands years of endless repetition. So this seems to be incompatible to some extent with the idea that street art is improvisational, because it seems very often prepared at home and exceedingly rehearsed. So how can these be improvisational? But actually, and here is the very basic philosophical question: what is improvisation? I think that both claims, like, for instance, Ulrich's criticism, but also, the claim that you can derive from what Chastanet says, they basically use an idea of improvisation that is sort of naive, or at least, it's too radical. In a sense that, improvisation, it's not essentially opposed to something that is rehearsed or something that requires certain preparation. Now, here is, for instance, what Phil Alperson wrote about, improvisation in one of his papers, and he writes, in a very general sense, we can think of improvisation as a kind of goal-directed activity. I need to find something to get this boulder out of the way, being done on the fly. Maybe I can use this branch as a lever to move the rock. Now, the point is that when you think about improvisation in these terms, it seems that basically everything that humans do is a form of improvisation. Speaking, talking, cooking, opening a door. So these, of course, will make the concept completely useless, because if everything is a form of improvisation, then we shouldn't talk about improvisation at all. Now, the point is that usually when we identify a particular practice or an action or a set of actions as improvisational, what we want to say is that that particular activity is characterized by a high degree of spontaneity and freedom. But again, this does not, in any sense, prevents the fact that that particular kind of activity that you call improvisational relies on routines, rituals, and repetitions. Think, for instance, about jazz. Now here we have, I put a picture of Louis Armstrong. Now the idea is that, of course, if you've ever studied jazz, or if you have a sense how you develop your improvisational skills in jazz music, what you do is basically, rehearsing constantly this vocabulary, and so acquiring the kind of, melodic language, the harmonic sensibility, the rhythmic pulse, and you do that through actually through rehearsal, through acquiring this, through routines. So there is, in this sense, insofar as we think that jazz is an improvised activity, there is no essential distinction between preparing something and actually then having turn that preparation into an improvised activity. So what we need when we have an improvised activity is the sense of freedom that is on display in the spontaneity of the activity. Of course, when you think about jazz, it's easy because how is it displayed, this freedom, this spontaneity? It's basically in the spontaneous reassembling of melodies that actually doesn't follow from any sort of prescribed score. So you have this sort of freedom that has to do with the fact that there's musicians, they just do on the fly their melodies. They invented their melodies on the fly as their rhythms, their interplay, and so forth and so on. Now, of course, the question is, where is street art's freedom on display? So here is one of the crucial aspects. So what I wanted to say is that you see that freedom in the spontaneous use of public spaces that essentially characterizes the activity of street artists. So the spontaneity of street art, so what makes it actually an improvised activity, has to do with appropriating surfaces. So by appropriating these surfaces in spontaneous ways, street art can be characterized and is improvised kind of activity. And so we see that in this urban art kind, as I define it, but you can call it whatever you want, art form, we're not going for details in this context. You see that street artists freely exploit those urban surfaces for creative self-expression. And here we have a beautiful picture that actually Carrie, who's not here also, but she's a very dear friend of ours, gave to me. And you see actually this is a very interesting interplay because of course, for instance, yard bombing seems to be one of the least spontaneous forms of street art because of course you have to need something beforehand. It's not that you do it like when you are sitting there, but still you see that, you can have this, you can make the decision of appropriating a certain kind of space, and then you see that actually Lady Muck used the previous installation and put something on top of it. So when I'm talking about the improvisational quality, nature of street art, that's what I have in mind. Not the fact that street artists just, they don't know what they are gonna, they don't know to do anything. It's just that they perform an activity that put on display a certain kind of freedom through a certain spontaneity. But what is spontaneity? Because of course, once again, you might think, this guy is bringing up the idea of spontaneity, but I'm not really sure what that means. Now here I'm following actually an account of spontaneity and creativity by Hausmann. So Hausmann actually writes this about spontaneity. So he writes that spontaneity manifests itself as a disruption within the word insofar as the word is a system of determinate events and objects existing in accord with enduring patterns. So when you witness spontaneity or where you perform something spontaneous, you witness something that occurs and introduces a discontinuity within the anticipated flow of events. Now, one of my favorite examples is a spontaneous hug. So when somebody hugs you and it's a spontaneous, which, it's a very powerful kind of feeling. So how is a spontaneous hug? How does it differ from a hug that is not spontaneous? Well, the idea is that it disrupts the expectations both of the hugged person and of the hugger. So, and you know, is this kind of discontinuity that makes it something spontaneous, the hug spontaneous. So here, you know, I think we have all the notions and the concepts, or at least a first approximation to understand how street art is actually spontaneous. So what I've been trying to say and suggest is that street artists use public surfaces freely. And they do it in two ways. So the first sense is for free. So without payment of any fee, or like, you know, without actually doing terms of an economic transaction. So today we already heard something about it. You know, I spoke about that at length in previous conferences and in my writings. And in a second sense, which I think it's actually more important in this context. So they use public spaces freely in the sense that they use them in ways that are unconstrained, unplanned, and voluntary. That's the kind of disruption of the expectations of the uses of public spaces. So this is the idea that street art is spontaneous insofar as it comes from a self-generating desire to express oneself, something that actually disrupts basically social norms. So it disrupts the expected patterns regulating visual communication in the city. Now, on this, when you look at street art from this angle and it's a spontaneity, actually, I think that a lot of people actually agree with me. I think that actually when, for instance, Ulrich says that, for instance, street art is self-authorized, it has in mind something like that, in the sense that it's something that introduces in the discontinuity and in the expected patterns that regulate the uses of public spaces. So that's, in a sense, I think that, you know, this idea perhaps, you know, from a different angle captures a lot of what people have been saying. So I'm not trying to say that, you know, this is something that I discovered, far from it. I think that actually a lot of people will agree with me. And it's just a way of framing in a slightly different way. In order to say something, you know, I think something illuminating, something a little more about, you know, street art. Now, here, what I wanted to introduce is this idea on the spot adaptation, because you say, well, you know, like, you know, you might say, you know, street art violates these norms of, but is it really spontaneous? How do you see that? You know, again, in jazz performances, you have this material that is recombined, and that's how spontaneity is put in display. So I think that actually what put in display this freedom of street artists, so the, you know, the spontaneity, are on-the-spot adaptations. So what are on-the-spot adaptations? They are these form, you know, these decisions taken on the fly that are consequences of the particular conditions wherein which street artworks are realized, conditions that require street artists to take decisions about fundamental features of their works, again, on the spot. Now, as I mentioned before, the notion aims at not discrediting like what Iveson was saying, but completing what he was saying. And, you know, you know, the paper that he wrote, I think it's brilliant, it's wonderful. So it develops this idea of tactical adaptations, which I think actually takes from McAdam. I'm not really sure, but, you know, people have, you know, they told me different things, but I think he has this idea, like, you know, from scholarship on, you know, basically, you know, warfare, you know, tactics of resistance, like militarism, actually. So he calls like these tactical adaptations as, you know, defines them as sort of counter tactics. So the idea is that, as, you know, we all know in the last, you know, 30 to 40 years, you know, governments across the world has developed tactics to contrast graffiti. And oftentimes they have been using tactics that have been developed for warfare. That's actually Iveson's point. And he shows you exactly, you know, how it has been done, you know, the cameras, you know, geographical profiling, all of these things, they come actually from warfare. And he says actually, you know, writers have been reacting against the development of these tactiques with their own counter tactics. So how are they counteracting these technologies of of control? So they accumulate, for instance, geographical knowledge of the city. They develop more effective technologies of counter surveillance, blocking the cameras. And, they can be as sophisticated as you can imagine. And for instance, they, this is the point. One of the points of Iveson is that they, increasingly writers are opting for quickly executed styles and safer installation places. Nice. McAdam actually, which I think is where Iveson is taking the idea, defines tactical adaptations as chess-like moves, aiming at neutralizing a situation of potential risk before it actually can happen. So here is the idea of tactical adaptation. Tactical adaptations are long-term shifts in know-how and that influence primarily the planning stages of creating a work of street art. So you have, the street artist has all this kind of knowledge, about, for instance, the geography of the city, or knows how to do certain things in order to prevent being caught and in order to be able to realize the artwork. Okay. But what I think is actually, tactical adaptations are never enough for a street artist to actually realize the work. So why? Because I think that actually no tactical adaptation can account for all contingencies. So think about, for instance, aspects of a street art with salient features such as the exact location and the size of a tag, for instance, or where to place a nit, the level of accuracy of the design of a stencil graffiti, or also the exact moment of execution. Now, all of this are usually decisions taken on the spot that respond to extemporaneous contextual conditions. So what you're looking at, what you're seeing, whether or not there is a guard, a person, there is a noise, or there isn't. Now here I have a video, but I don't think we have time, but just to give you a sense, this is actually a video, very funny.
We are on the final five.
Yeah. No, we don't have many, but I keep it here so you can actually watch it. It's on YouTube. It's actually Graffiti Fail. Those are actually videos that, Graffiti Fails, like, they just take the format of the failure videos where, somebody's trying to do something and then it fails or she fails.
Maybe you can share on the chat.
Yeah, sure. But I mean, it's super famous. I mean, you just Google it and, on YouTube, you can find many of them. So what you see in the videos actually are moments where, there is a breaking of the performance of the creation of the work because certain contextual conditions change dramatically. And so the writers or the street artists have to adapt, and actually they actually usually stop painting. But that is actually not necessary. Sometimes, you can hide or you can do all sorts of other things in order to complete the work. And that's what I'm, the kind of thing I'm interested in, or I'm trying to talk about. So one of the things that it's important to me when we think about these conditions of forced spontaneity, so again, you have to take this decision and react on the spot, is that this will realize and will be essentially connected to an aesthetics of imperfection. Why? Because actually, when you realize, when a street artist creates a work, generally it does that, or she does that, with lack of deliberation. So with, in a temporal sequence that is linear, without the possibility of going back and revising the work. And now here, as I mentioned, usually in the literature on improvisation, people have been talking about the expressiveness that actually this gives. So and Andy Hamilton talk about, this unpredictability and excitement, which actually connects to formal imperfection, and to this, sort of, unpolished and irregular and disordered features. Here you see a beautiful tag of Fraud 32, and you can see all of these imperfections in the tag, which is not actually polished. So it has like these dripping areas where you don't see the color, where the color actually is not there. Now, why is this important? It's important because our cities are actually perfect places, or are designed to be perfect places. So the broken window theory or hypothesis by Wilson Kelly is actually a form of perfectionist aesthetics. So what they're arguing for is exactly the fact that you should not have signs of imperfection in the aesthetics of the city. Why? Because any sign of disorder as a violation of decorum will lead to greater violence and, and problems. But actually, as I mentioned, imperfections is essentially related to spontaneity. And spontaneity is what actually makes our life satisfactory. So there are, theorists, interested in urban lives that actually argue that one of the problems that we are facing today, and been facing for a long time, is actually that we have, spontaneity in our lives is eroding. So we are losing the ability of being spontaneous. And we are living, or the idea, the goal is to make us live in these like environments, which are safe. If Jacob is here, I remember last year we talked about that, about safety, but trading safety for spontaneity. They are safe, of course, but they are commercialized and homogenized, and they lack in authenticity. Now, here, and I heard it before also, the idea of the right to the city. So what I'm talking about is actually a way of recasting the idea of the right to the city. So the right to the city, and so what David Harvey writes about in developing the Fevre's idea, so as the freedom to make and remake our cities and ourselves, is actually a right to improvise in or just the city. And so I see street art's improvisational nature as essentially connected to this desire to reclaim the city. A improvisational nature that is essentially connected to these spontaneous uses of public spaces, which, by de jure, you might say, or in principle even, violate the dominant hierarchies of visibility, and so the dominant aesthetics of our cities. And so I want to conclude with this idea that actually improvisation in street art is not just about expressiveness, it becomes a political action. So let's conclude by saying, urban improvisers of the world, unite. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrea from China there. So good. I think the first one to raise the hand was Malcolm. Malcolm?
Yes, maybe Andrea should quit sharing the screen, or?
Go.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Andrea, for a fantastic presentation. Very inspiring. Good to see you. So I have one comment and one question. The comment is that when you describe spontaneity, whatever I can say it even, it sounds a little like what Garfinkel in ethnomethodology call a breaching experiment, where you kind of see what happens when you break patterns, and then you see how social interaction usually works. So I found that interesting if there are similarities there with your definition. But then what my question more was like the relation between individual and group here, because you talked about decisions on the spot, which sounded like the individual were more reflective at the specific time, but you also talk about like routines and rituals that you're kind of learned how to practice street art. And that seems more like a social pattern or a cultural practice that are not that individual. So it would be interesting to hear your reflection on that.
Yeah, no, wonderful, Malcolm, as usual. Now, on the first part, you should send me the reference, because I don't know. I'm sure that, again, like it's probably something that has to do, it's similar with what I was talking about, again, the account of spontaneity that I use comes from, from philosophy. So, it's that kind of domain, but it sounds, more or less what I was trying to do, breaking social expectations. Now, of course, perhaps in different contexts, it might actually mean different things. And today, of course, breaking expectations about uses of public spaces might actually, carry certain political significances. About the second point, yes, wonderful. I mean, as you know, like I actually think that, again, I define it, and I talked about street art as appropriating and sharing culture. So the idea is that, again, there is not even much space to think about the individual or, the author in traditional senses. So by all means, I think that, all these practices are actually developed in social ways. And it's interesting now because I'm thinking that most of the videos that, in the video that I was showing, actually, in most cases, you see actually groups of people. Mm-hmm. So it's not even like perhaps, decision taken by just an individual. Now, of course, perhaps that's my training that makes me, leaning towards the idea of always thinking about individuals. But absolutely. So I think it's very true. And now here it might actually be interesting because, again, as I mentioned, sometimes improvisational activities, and this has been done for jazz, has been considered ethical metaphors for constructions of community. So it might actually be, sounds very plausible to me. Then now you can see that level also in terms of improvisation in street art. So there is not just the political aspect, but also maybe the ethical in terms of group interaction. Thank you.
Thanks. I maybe I add that not exclusively a group activity, because also individually, like for instance, calligraphy, we practice calligraphy systematically as individuals, all by ourselves. Then we show to others, and maybe others will add our knowledge to our end experience. But even jazz musicians, they need to practice a lot alone, so they can then share with others and learn with others also. So I think it's both individual and then collective.
Yeah, no, but by all means, I just think that actually Malcolm found the fact that, was highlighting the fact that it was a little lacking.
With reason, yeah, for sure. I think I don't know if Logan, if Lima, maybe Lima first. She's saying, yeah, Lima.
Yeah. Hi, Andrea. Nice to see you.
Nice to see
Hi.
you too.
Yeah, it was a surprise what one person more wrote about improvisation. Hello?
I saw that. Yeah.
Yes, because I just published an article on improvisation, but my focus is more on experience and as well as research as an improvisation. I myself, I have 15 years of training as improviser from different backgrounds, both from miming and physical dance and different fields, So for me, it's just like several questions arranged, and I think, as you know, improvisation is very complex, and exactly as you are navigating to what Bertinetto, I'm referring to him, brilliant philosopher on improvisation, and he talks about complexity of improvisation, and exactly as you're talking between the spontaneous and routinized, and in some way, you need to be very skillful improviser in order to achieve the spontaneity. But I have a trouble a little bit. I think you navigated a little bit too broad because for me it becomes uncertain if you're talking about a tag, or you're talking about a conventional art, or you are talking about what kind of form, because each form, as you know, street art is all universe, and you cannot capture everything in one paper, all the universe. So for me as well, raise a question about when you're using word imperfection, because single tag can be such a perfectionism. So it depends how we define this perfection and perfection. Are we talking about a fluidity of the skills, or is it about, you know, aesthetical perfection, you know, because like now I had a lot of time during COVID to walk in Oslo city, and Oslo is fabulous city when it comes to tagging. It's a brilliant, and I find it there is so much skill, and there is so much, like, you know, as well choreography in relation to the environment. So for me, it's like, it's more like a reflection about that, you know, but it's cool, you know, to take it think, and maybe we could take exchange, you know, and I can share my article. Yes.
Sure, you should, by all means. I'm very curious. Well, actually, this is a terrific question, because of course, it, you know, it points at a part that it's, you know, very underdeveloped in the talk. Now, actually, I've been working on matters of perfectionism and imperfectionism for a few years. It's been actually a project that we carried out with a group in Japan. So, you know, it's tricky, because usually in traditionally, you think that when you talk about imperfection, you're talking about something bad. So that aesthetic positivity is related to perfection. So I guess that what you're saying, well, you know, but some of these tags are terrific. How can they be imperfect, right? Something like that. So there, you know, I think that the key point is to understand that some of the elements are actually unpolished. Now, for instance, think about the white garden. The white garden might be actually very beautiful, but some of its elements can actually be imperfect, wild. So there might be, you know, not very controlled. You know, there might be parts that go here and there, and that's part of its beauty. And there is another sense in which actually tags, for instance, are imperfect, because they violate order. So it's not just about simple aesthetics. I think that there is an aesthetic aspect. So even, again, it doesn't mean that you're not skillful. Because of course, you actually, you know, these are things that require a huge amount of skills. And, you know, if you see, you know, tags from somebody who has a, you know, great flow, it's just, you know, it's beautiful. No, but there are some elements that you might notice that are actually imperfect. I draw actually a comparison with schools of calligraphy in the East. So when you look at calligraphy, for instance, Chinese calligraphy, there are elements that are imperfect because you can't control perfectly the flow of the brush. But, you know, that kind of rough and unpolished features, just like in jazz, they actually have an aesthetic positivity. So it's an imperfection that actually has an aesthetic positivity. And the other sense, it's actually the violation of order. So they are imperfect because they violate the ways in which the city should look like. So, you know, I have some examples when I wrote that piece. But for instance, if you look at the, you know, this piece by 32, it actually violates all sorts of, you know, color codes, surfaces. So that, you know, you see that it's imperfect with respect to the whole design. So that's what I mean by imperfection.
Yeah, but then again, you are talking now a lot about tagging, you know. So
sorry.
maybe you could.
You asked me first about what kind of. So now here it's back to my.
Yeah, because when you use the street art, when it is so broad, because it can be like, you know, muralism as well, like this perfection, imperfection is changing and evolving constantly, you know. And now we are talking exactly like, you know, itself can be one paper about perfection, imperfection, philosophical question, right?
Sure. No, by all means. I actually, you know, as I mentioned today, I actually skipped my definition of street art. You know, people here know now as I have a very specific idea of what street art is, in the sense that for me, street art is actually subversive art that, again, realizes its subversiveness through the use of public space. So, and it violates the distribution of the sensible, which, you know, in some cases, you know, I call the dominant one as what's it called, the corporate regime of visibility. So a lot of things that actually you're talking about. So muralism for me is not street art, and for me the core example of street art are actually graffiti. It's gonna actually come out in Estetica. The blue, what's it called? Is the subtitle is the European Journal of Aesthetics. It's gonna come out soon. This What is Street Art, where I actually try to clarify this. And I mean, again, I have a very, very specific idea. So what you're saying is true. Like, you know, you might say, well, you know, we call street art a lot of stuff that actually is not imperfect. Well, my answer is that for me, that is not street art.
But why you call it graffiti? Why shouldn't we call it tagging?
I think tagging is a variety of graffiti.
Yeah. Okay, we're not gonna go there.
Okay, maybe we shift to Logan. Lima, yeah. Logan, please. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi. Since this seems like a quite tight-knit community, I'll just introduce myself briefly. I am an undergraduate researcher at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington State. So it's a little bit early right now, but I couldn't miss this presentation.
Good morning.
So you didn't mention it that much, Andrea, but I'm interested just in the performance aspect of your ontology, specifically because as I've been thinking more on it, I'm wondering if in viewing the work product as a sort of secondary feature of a generative performance that is more preferential to a certain form of street art than others. So for example, we do not, I would not say if I was looking at one of the standard tags that you put of FRI 32, I'm not necessarily appreciating for the aesthetic value that I would a sort of complex work, say by Blue. And so in describing the work product as sort of ancillary, do you think that you are possibly, I guess, neglecting the appreciative aspect of a work that is more, I guess, involved or not so focused on the spatial placement of the street art?
Oh, yeah, that's a terrific question. Actually, you got to know, just to say, you know, Logan is a student of a friend of mine, and he contacted me a couple of weeks ago. So we have had a few exchanges, and it's a brilliant guy. You know, when you find somebody like that, you know, it makes everything, you know, like our lives make sense, because that's, you know, there's a hope for humanity. So I think what you're saying is true. One of the things that I set forth when I, you know, started writing about these things is to, let's say, recenter the core cases. So, you know, even in my book, I said it, like, you know, I you know, for me, graffiti is the center of street art. So one of the things I've been, you know, trying to correct or, you know, suggest is that, you know, the graffiti is at the core of the movement. So that actually what is the value that we see in street art is the value that we see in graffiti. And so rather than, you know, focusing on these cases, like, you know, you mentioned Blue, I rather focus on other kinds of cases. Because again, I think, you know, of course, you know, Blue's works, you know, some of them are very complex, and, you know, they have, of course, features that you might not see in the tag. And, you know, I don't want to deny that is, of course, the case. But I think that what is actually interesting, what sets apart street art from other forms of art in public spaces, other forms of urban art, like new muralism, it's actually really the use of the space and the performative aspect that actually is lacking. And again, you know, it's always the same story. It's not that, you know, at some point you find something that it's one thing or another. Is always a continuum. And so you see that, you know, works might be placed in different, you know, at different degrees. And of course, tags, which for me are the best example, because, you know, my favorite forms of graffiti. Of course, the most radical form of performative intervention in public space, because if that's just really something that has that kind of quality, more than even more complex pieces. And of course you can go to in the continuum towards other varieties that might actually reduce that. And of course, you might want to draw a line somewhere. Might actually have to do it case by case. But I think, yes, that in a nutshell, that you're right. I am actually preferring a certain kind of core examples, which, by the way, I think it's what philosophers have always been doing. I mean, Aristotle favored certain examples of tragedy in order to define tragedy. So I'm favoring a certain set of examples in order to define and talk about what street art is.
Great. Lima, you still your hand up, or it's no? You're concluded. Yeah, we can.
I forgot to
no
turn
problem.
off.
Yeah,
I see the comment by Peter. Yeah, I think it's it talks about explorative potential. Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think it is. Again, as I mentioned before, Peter, like I think that what I'm trying to do, it actually captures a lot of what a lot of people have been saying. So it's it's just a slightly different way to frame it. And as Logan mentioned, I use this to develop my ontology of street art as performances that some of you might have heard 4 years ago, I think, 2017, first time I presented the idea. And then I see Isabel, Détournement. Yeah, this actually was, she mentioned, concept of tactique in the chessboard. Actually, Bertinetto, when when we were talking, about the paper, the chapter is going to be in the handbook. He said that actually thinks that Iveson took it from there. I'm not really sure. I mean, there is some continuity, but actually in Détournement, I think the tactic can be also what I call on-the-spot adaptations. I think it has like a slightly different, like a broader sense of what a tactic is. He talks about tactics, but I think it's a little broader. And so, yeah, I spent quite a few time in order to understand where the concept came from, because actually Iveson doesn't refer to any specific literature. I think maybe at some point, but it wasn't clear. So I started to go through, and I think actually that I catch the kind of angle that it was coming from. So there is something in Détournement, but I think that I wanted to have something that was a little more sort of a dichotomy, which of course it's always difficult. And actually, if you read the chapter, I also think that there are interactions between on-the-spot adaptations and tactical adaptations, so you can see them actually interacting with one another. But I wanted something that could map a little more clearly the distinction in order to make sense of the improvisational aspect, because again, I think that tactical adaptations are more related to the planning part. On-the-spot adaptations are more about these sort of on-the-fly reactions, or reactions on the fly, better to say.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Great, as usual. So I thank you so much. And we are a little bit late already for the next panel. So I will stop recording just to make a break here. And